period of democracy and human rights, and the argumentative Indian too is now bereft of the power of speech in the face of an ontological abyss. To be human is to translate, but the evil of Khappansats is what questions all attempts at communication and translation and the hermeneutics of culture. Let us now reaffirm our faith in a democratic India and fair attitude. The culture of translation and fair play, or the dangers of a Holocaust, are simply staring us at our face. This is indeed very sad. We are now holding conferences on translation, but then this is what has been happening. For the last few decades since independence, people in the Northeast had the feeling that they were always sought to be marginalized. And what the Khappansat has now been doing is more or less the same thing. It is the culmination of an entire process. Anyway, I'm not going into all this. I'll just restrict myself to 2 or 3 observations on how we have been translating for the last 6 or 7 centuries. I'll talk about 2 different phases of Assamese culture. First, of course, maybe from the 13th century to the 18th century, when we found ourselves translating what may be called the Sanskrit India, the classical kind of India. We translated the Puranas, we translated the epics, and the first Assamese book, the first Assamese text, composed in the late 13th century, was an adaptation of a story from the Vamana Purana, that is Prahlada Charitra, composed in the 13th century. And incidentally, that also may be said to have ushered in a new wave. We later identified with the Vaishnavized Renaissance or the Bhakti Renaissance. And it was during the period of Shankardeva particularly, we imported all sorts of ideas, including not merely classical India or Sanskrit India, but also, it was Shankardeva and his chief disciple Madhavadeva who translated Malayalam poet, Kula Sekhar Alwar, who was one of the great Alwar saints, and a few stanzas from his Mukundamala came to be translated, not merely by Shankardeva, but also Madhavadeva. In some of his lyrics, for example, Shankardeva had echoed one of the greatest Tamil poets of all time, Vedanta Desika. There is that interesting text called Paduka Sahasram of Vedanta Desika, and Shankardeva had echoed some of these sentences. So not merely classical India, but by classical India I mean the Puranas, the epics, and Ramayana came to be translated into Assamese way back in the 14th century, that is Madhava Kandali's Ramayana. Later, it was during the 16th century, Shankardeva found that only 5 cantos had survived. Therefore, he instructed his disciple Madhavadeva to render the Adikanda into Assamese vernacular, and he himself undertook the task of translating the Uttarakanda. Anyway, right from the 13th century down to the 18th, we in Assam found ourselves translating what may be called the classical Indian culture, Puranas, epics, the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, and so on and so forth. We also shaped our vernacular accordingly. For example, way back in the 16th century or the 17th century, we evolved a kind of prose, which was more or less a translation from several different texts, including the Bhagavad Purana and the Bhagavad Gita. The second phase of translation started in the 19th century. Assam was annexed in the year 1826, and it was under the impact of the Baptist mission that the very idea of useful knowledge came to be very popular in Assam. Useful knowledge, in contrast to what we call the useless knowledge. Useful knowledge. That was an American concept, and they also produced lots of books, including Library of Useful Knowledge. There was one Hindu college educated Assamese young man called Anandaram Dhekiyalpukon, who wrote an interesting article way back in 1847. The name of the article was called England or Bibaran, a description of England. In fact, that itself was based on some of the entries on geography in Chambers' dictionary, in Chambers' biographical dictionary, or for example, some of the texts on European history, geography, and so on. But the point is, it was on the basis of translation that he could articulate a set of feelings very interesting. For example, I'll say something about the article itself, England or Bibaran. It's just a description of England in geographical terms, in terms of history and so on. But the point is, there is a new dream of learning that has emerged. If you don't mind, I'll just try to quote the Assamese original, He Kripamoy Jagadishwar. I'll give you that rough English translation. Ei Ahom Deshor Lokhokolok Sodeh Sabhya Gyani Aru Dharmik Koribole Moti Dia. I think I should first give you the English translation. O gracious Lord of the world, give the people of Assam the inclination to civilize their land. That's the first idea of civilization introduced. To infuse it with knowledge and righteousness, invest them with the ability to be aware of their deficiencies and depravity, and with your manifold energy, civilize them and make them fit to know you and obey your order. O Lord, soon bring in the day when flower gardens will replace the jungles of Assam. It was not exactly a flower garden, I think it was a botanical garden. Or for example, the idea of a public park, because just a year ago, the first public park was established in Greater Manchester area. I think it was in 1846, and this article was written in 1847. So the idea of a public park, because earlier what England had were some parks meant for the members of the royal family, like Hyde Park for example. The first public park was established only in 1846, and later it was named after one of the British Prime Ministers, Peel Park. Oh Lord, soon bring in the day when flower gardens will replace the jungles of Assam. The small boats will be replaced by steamers. Houses made of brick and mortar will replace bamboo cottages. Thousands of schools, societies of knowledge. Societies of knowledge. For example, it was something like knowledge society, like for example the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal, or Bethune Society, of which Anandaram Dhekiyalpukon himself was one of the founder members. So these were new ideas introduced into Assamese vernacular, and these ideas were possible because of translation. Thousands of schools, societies of knowledge, hospitals, and shelter houses for the poor. These were absolutely new ideas. For example, shelter houses for the poor, or for example, the very idea of a hospital, because during the 600 years of Ahom rule, we didn't have any public hospital of any kind. And when our people will get over mutual distrust and love one another as brothers, when one will not falsely depose oneself in the law court for just a 2 rupee pack of opium and set aside even an amount of 100,000 rupees, when one will not do injustice to the other in return for a bribe of crores of rupees, and when prostitution, opium and wine will be like things unknown in the land. If you don't mind, I will just give you the Assamese original now. He Kripamoy Jagadishwar. This is based entirely on translation of books which were almost geography textbooks or history textbooks. হে কৃপাময় জগদীশ্বৰ এই অসম দেশৰ লোকসকলক স্বদেশ সভ্য জ্ঞানী আৰু ধাৰ্মিক কৰিবলৈ মতি দিয়া সিবিলাকৰ অভাৱ আৰু দুৰৱস্থা জানিবলৈ সিবিলাকক জ্ঞান দিয়া আৰু তোমাৰ বিচিত্ৰ শক্তিৰে সিবিলাকক সভ্য কৰা আৰু তোমাক জানিবৰ আৰু আজ্ঞা পালিবৰ যোগ্য কৰা যি সময়ত অসম হাবি গুছি ফুলবাৰী হ'ব নৈত ডোঙা গুছি জাহাজ হ'ব ঘৰ বাঁহৰ গুছি শিলিটাৰ হ'ব গাঁৱে গাঁৱে হেজাৰে হেজাৰে পঢ়াশালী জ্ঞানৰ সভা চিকিৎসালয় দুখীয়া দৰিদ্ৰ পৰিত্ৰাণৰ আলয় হ'ব আৰু যি কালত লোকসকলে পৰস্পৰ হিংসা নকৰি আটায়ে আটাইক ভাতৃপদ চেনেহ কৰিব কেৱে দুটকা কানিৰ সলনি মিছা সাক্ষী নিদি লাখ টকাকো কাটি কৰি থব কোটি টকা ভেটি পায়ো কাৰো অন্যায় নকৰিব বেশ্যা কানি আৰু সুৰা এই কথা দেশত লোকে ভুল নোপোৱা হ'ব সেই সময় হে পৰম পিতা জগদীশ্বৰ শীঘ্ৰে ঘটোৱা Incidentally, the article is based on 3 or 4 books, like for example, Hugh Murray, the Encyclopedia of Geography, published in 1839, Linley Murray, Introduction to the English Reader, Peter Perley's Common School History, 1841, and there are also interesting translations from Arabian Nights, or for example, Hymns in Prose for Children by Anna Leticia Barbauld. Actually, even many of our students of English literature do not know that Anna Leticia Barbauld was one of the most important romantic writers. Wordsworth was also familiar with. It was during the early 19th century that Anandaram Dhekial Phukan had translated these texts into Assamese vernacular. Sorry. I will now say a few things about how the canonical Indian text came to be transformed or transmuted. For example, I think it was Ashok Vajpayee who talked about a new lease of life being given to the translated text. I'll refer to 3 very interesting Indian texts. For example, Markandeya Purana. Markandeya Purana is a very interesting text because it is always to be found together with another classic text called Chandi, which is the canonical text for the Shakti worshippers. Markandeya Purana, this is number 1. Then number 2 is one particular episode from the Bhagavad Purana, 8th canto. And finally, the Uttarakanda Ramayana. How all these texts came to be transformed or transmuted. We now talk about diversity and dialogue. How the canonical Indian tradition came to be diversified is what matters here. For example, we received those canonical Indian texts in our own way. For example, there are 2 different levels. One is the folk level, which is why the Valmiki Ramayana, Uttarakanda, came to be transformed altogether. For example, Sita now has a kind of voice which you won't find in other different versions of Indian Ramayana. For example, it is Sita now who accuses Rama of the gross kind of injustice. She even says that, okay, do you know you would have been guilty of triple murder because you told Lakshmana to take me to the forest, and you also instructed Lakshmana to abandon me there in the forest. Do you know you would have been guilty of triple murder because Lava and Kusha were there in my womb. So you are a murderer. You are guilty of treachery. You are a liar, for example. So this is what Sita has been saying to someone whom we worship as a Maryada Purushottama. So there is a very rich kind of folk text which sustains the entire narrative. It is not merely the canonical Indian tradition, it is the canonical Indian tradition mixed with the folk kind of harmony, the other harmony. And incidentally, since we now find ourselves talking about diversity and dialogue, do you know, we in the Northeast, we are 8 different states: Arunachal, Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, Sikkim.